Hey, everybody. Quick announcement. This podcast has a new name. From here on out, it'll be called, wait for it, the North Carolina Rabbit Hole. Which, if you know what I've been doing lately, that makes sense, right? North Carolina Rabbit Hole is the name of the weekly newsletter I've been writing for more than 3 years now. It's at ncrabbithole.com. It's free if you want it to be, although, if you want to support the newsletter and this podcast, you can become a monthly or yearly paid subscriber. Anyhow, it seemed right to give both of those things the same name, so that's what I'm going to do. As for Away Message, which was the former name of this podcast for, almost 7 years, do not worry. All of those old episodes, there are more than 40 by my count, they are not going anywhere. They will still live on in this feed. And even though this podcast has a new name, I feel like the spirit of Away Message lives on here and in the newsletter and in a lot of the things that I do. So, thank you for listening. And now, here's today's show. This is the North Carolina Rabbit Hole. I'm Jeremy Markovich. For more than a decade, I've been doing something, well, sort of sneaky. Something meant to make it seem like I'm doing something I'm not. Now, it's not devious per se. Rather, it's just something that you're not really supposed to notice. Now, this thing, I've given it a name. A name that only a few select people have known, but it's a name that, after a decade, I'm finally ready to share with the world. It's called the Dick Trickle maneuver. Okay, now I am sure that a lot of you also do this thing. I did not invent this maneuver, and I'm almost certain that Dick Trickle also did not invent this maneuver. Trickle was a race car driver who tragically took his own life in 2013. He grew up in Wisconsin, where he became a legendary short track driver. Then, at age 48, he gave NASCAR a try, moved to North Carolina, and became nationally known in the 1990s because of ESPN. Dan Patrick and Keith Olbermann loved to say his name on SportsCenter.
And to Bristol to see who won in NASCAR and where Dick Trickle finished.
Trickle was an old school guy. The racing world changed around him, but he never did. He was the kind of guy who won a lot of big races in small places. He always seemed to have a case of beer nearby and a cigarette in his hand, even when he was behind the wheel of a race car.
Dick Trickle, who is having a cigarette. You know, he has a cigarette lighter in the car. He just reached for it.
Reminds us of the days of David Pearson. He used to do that all the time.
Bad habits are very hard to break
They
even when
sure
you're
are.
driving a race car.
Now, I know a lot about Dick Trickle. Back in 2013, I wrote a profile of his life and legacy for SBNation.com, but I never actually got to meet the man himself. So, recently, I call up someone who did.
He was exactly what you wanted from a short track racer.
This is Ryan McGee, a senior writer for ESPN who's covered NASCAR for a really long time. And I talked to him because I wanted to know if this thing that I've been doing for a decade, the Dick Trickle maneuver, whether anyone else knew about that too. But we'll get to that.
My favorite Dick Trickle moment ever was racetracks used to, I think they still do a lot of them, but most of their safety crews are local guys, like local EMTs and, fire department guys and ambulance drivers and whatever else. And we were at Talladega, and just by chance, it was 1,000 degrees, and I was just looking for somewhere to hide with air conditioning. And in the Goodyear building, which was this big warehouse building right in the middle of the infield, they had brought in Dick Trickle to talk to the local EMT crews. And I'll never forget it. It was like, because what they wanted is, it's like, all right, when you're getting a driver out of the car, you want to do this and make sure you ask this and make sure you don't ask that or whatever. And Dick was standing there holding a cup of coffee and a pack of cigarettes. And he said, listen, guys, honestly, he goes, if I crash, he goes, when you come to the car, if you just bring me a cup of coffee and a cigarette, I'll be fine. But that was it. That's all you need to know about Dick. That's just exactly who he was. He talked like he had a mouthful of gravel. And I don't know that he never was rich, but he certainly made more than he expected to. So he was exactly who you wanted him to be.
So he seemed like somebody whose perception from
maybe like people who followed NASCAR, and I'm thinking people who followed NASCAR maybe in the 90s,
Yeah.
who also watched a lot of Sports Center, or just sort of like the perception of who he was and kind of what kind of a driver he was very different than the reality of the actual talent that he had and the personality that he had.
Right. And what was interesting was I experienced both sides of that personally because I had been a NASCAR fan, and then I went to work for ESPN in the mid 90s at the height of the Big Show with Keith Olbermann and Dan Patrick on Sunday nights. I worked as a production assistant, cutting highlights and answering the phones and running teleprompter. And that's when every Sunday night, Keith and Dan would do their running joke that went on for years, which is, all right, Dale Earnhardt wins at, Martinsville, and here's your top 5. And they would always say, and Dick Trickle finished 18th. They would always update you. And so I experienced that where Dick kind of became a national joke because of that name. And then a year later, I was working on our first nightly motorsports show, RPM Tonight, and going to the racetrack every weekend. And so I got to know Dick on the flip side of him being like this national joke to the national stick and ball sports center audience. And he thought it was hilarious. Like it didn't bother him at all. There was a time I don't think in the beginning, I don't think he liked it, but he ended up embracing it. And at one point, I think he actually talked to Keith about it. I know he did at once. I think he talked to Dan too. But yeah, he was. You have the guys who race. Tony Stewart was like this. Kenny Schrader was like this. The Midwestern short track guys that would come race in the Cup Series or back in the Busch Series, now Xfinity or trucks or whatever, because they could make money and they could make a lot of money and they could obviously win at the highest level. But the reality is that all those guys I listed, and Dick Trickle is the top of that list, he would have been perfectly fine just to race short tracks the rest of his life and make $500 per win. He just is one of those guys that transferred over to the Cup Series and never changed. Most of these guys, you win money and there's women and there's trophies and you're traveling the world and you're starring in TV commercials and you change. Dick never changed at all. And to me, that's why he's the ultimate short track guy.
So talking about the difference between guys maybe who go to NASCAR and change and guys who go to NASCAR and never change, one of the things it sounds like that Dick Trickle was legendary for was not even so much that like he was a talented driver, but just sort of like he became the life of the party after a race, always hanging out with the guys for as late as they hung out.
So you always saw that if you go to any short track, right? You go to the Lancaster Speedway down in South Carolina, you go to Caraway Speedway. I mean, just give me Concord, Hickory, just give me any short track. And that's what you do. Races usually on Saturday night. Most of the guys that are racing at your local short track, they got day jobs. So Saturday night, they blow it out. And if they didn't win the race and if they don't hate the guy that won, they're going to party with him through the night. And Dick still did that. My lasting forever image of Dick Trickle was he had won, again, we call it the Xfinity Series now, but forever it was the Busch Series, in the 80s and 90s. It's kind of the AAA level of stock car racing. And my forever image of Dick was, I believe it was at Hickory Motor Speedway. I know it was either Hickory or South Boston. It was one of our local, Carolinas, Virginia short tracks, and he won a Busch Series race. And, they do the whole thing in Victory Lane where they crack open the beers and they spray and all this other stuff. And I'll never forget, it all ends and they do the hat dance and take all the pictures and everybody's loading up the haulers. And my image of Dick was him walking back to Victory Lane after everything had calmed down. And he grabbed 2 cases of Busch beer that were sitting there for what was just supposed to be the celebration, spraying the beer, and him leaving Victory Lane with, a 12-pack on each shoulder and smoking, free Winston cigarettes that he got from the Winston Cup Series, and he got his free beer, and him winking at me and walking out of Victory Lane. And I was like, that's it. I mean, that's all that dude wants. The money's great and the travel's awesome. And, even being a national name because of your name, all that stuff's fine. But at the end of the day, all he lived for was that moment right there. And in the Busch Series, they'd hook you up, because you'd won a Busch Series event, and Dick took advantage of the hookup.
So something that I came across when I was reporting on Dick Trickle after his death back in 2013 was I talked to Kenny Wallace for a while, and Kenny Wallace I know is like one of these guys who you could talk to for hours and hours and hours, and you will be entertained for hours and hours and hours. And one of the things that he told me was something that I've been calling the Dick Trickle maneuver. And it is, I've been employing it myself now, I think ever since that story has come on. But I'm curious if you ever heard of this. So the story goes from Kenny.
One of the great secrets of Dick Trickle is everybody said he would drink beer, drink beer. Now, there's no doubt that Dick drank beer. But, here was and I'm not telling on him. It's just awesome.
When Dick Trickle would be hanging out after a race, somebody would throw him a can of beer.
When Dick Trickle was drinking beer, he had the same beer in his hand all night.
And he'd crack open the can of beer, and he would drink the can of beer, and he'd get down to about the last couple drops of it, and he would just kind of keep on holding it.
So everybody thought Dick was just drinking all this beer. Well, he did drink a beer or two or three, but Dick would take a beer, he would drink it, and it'd be about empty, and he'd just keep it in his hand. And he loved people.
And everybody else around him would keep on drinking, and they'd keep on talking, and he'd keep on hanging out, and he'd be smoking and then drinking, Yep. And so everybody else just looks over at him, and they're like, oh, Dick's still going.
Yeah, and I got to keep up with Dick, right?
They got to keep up with Dick. Well, Dick wouldn't keep it up. He would just keep it up with himself.
So Dick was not this big drinker like everybody thought he was. Yes, he did stay out late, but he had so much camaraderie. And you got to remember, he was winning all the time. So when you're winning, it's easy to stay out and celebrate with your friends. But Dick didn't slam 12 beers.
Yep. So he would just keep on doing that. And so some of these guys would party all night, and they would just keep on. He'd finish a beer, and they would crack open another one right after that. And Dick would keep on holding it for a while.
Yep.
And that was his secret. That was his trick. So everybody got drunk with Dick, but Dick never got drunk with them. And Kenny Wallace told me that he didn't know this until he had been out drinking with Dick Trickle many, many times.
And Dick shared that with me. And I finally looked at him. I said, oh, my God. You're not responsible for how many times I got drunk because of you now? So,
first off, I guess the thing is, had you ever heard about this sort of thing that he would do?
Yeah. I used to do it in college. I wasn't a drinker in college at all. And so I'd carry the one drink around, all night. But there were two things about that. Number one, Dick felt almost a fatherly role, particularly with the Kenny Wallaces and the guys that came out of the Midwest, because he was their hero.
Yeah.
And so there was a part of that where Dick's like, I don't mind being the king of the party, but I'm going to make sure everybody gets home okay, right? But then the other flip side of that was that put this within the context of those 1,000 short track wins, because there's typically an event on Friday night, an event on Saturday night, and then maybe an event on Sunday afternoon. And if everyone else has been drinking their faces off and you had 2 beers, then guess what? Saturday, when it's time to race again, they're not ready, and you're ready. And I pressed Dick on that one time because I'd heard about this. Is that part of the strategy of beating these guys on Saturday and Sunday after you've raced them on Friday night? And he would not answer the question. He just smiled. So I think it was fatherly, but it was also selfishly, it was a it was a way to it was an advantage, right? It was the competitive advantage that came with that too.
It's funny because I think now, if you don't want to drink, you don't have to drink. You know what I mean?
Right.
I think society has changed in a way where nobody dings you for not having a beer in your hand all the time in a way that maybe you would have gotten dinged 30 years ago for just socially. And so it's interesting. I'm I still do this thing. I used it last weekend out somewhere, and I was no, I'm going to hang on to this beer for an hour and a half. Because I just don't want to have that much tonight. But I'm you know what? Nobody cares. Nobody's paying attention to this. And also, nobody really pays attention. And if you say I'm not drinking, nobody really that people have moved on now. It's just he seems like an interesting person who did really interesting stuff and was thoughtful about what he did, but lived his life in a way that is now just so unique and just so interesting to hear about today.
Yeah, and now. But NASCAR has entered this age of nostalgia, that you and I both experienced with baseball, in the 80s and 90s when guys started making all the money and it became about millionaire contracts and all that stuff. And so that's when the baseball memorabilia boom happened, right? And then all of a sudden that's when we're going to our dads and saying, well, tell us about what it was like to see Mickey Mantle play and all that. And I think we're going through that in NASCAR, where we have this ridiculously talented group of young racers, but it's just different now. It's been corporatized, and you can't do it the way Dick Trickle did it. You can't do it the way Kenny Wallace did it. You can't do it the way those guys, Kenny Schrader, all those guys, you can't do it the way those guys did it then now. It has to be different. And so as a result, it's interesting because my hero, my third grandfather, my mentor when I first started in this business 30 years ago was the great Tom Higgins, who's the original NASCAR beat writer. He's in the NASCAR Hall of Fame, wrote for the Charlotte Observer forever, from Burnsville, North Carolina. And I used to drive Pap crazy because I would ask him questions about, well, what was Fireball Roberts like? And what was Banjo Matthews like? And what was it like covering races at Hillsboro and all these places? And now I'm at this phase of my career after I've been doing it for 30 years that when I talk to young media members, they ask me questions about Dick Trickle like I used to ask Tom Higgins, about Curtis Turner. And I think there's a nostalgia thing that's happening right now. And I'm sorry, there's a lot of reasons that I'm sad that Dick Trickle's no longer with us. But the biggest reason is that there's this generation of people now that didn't get to know him. And we talk all the time. I'll go to Daytona for the 500 in February, and we'll have the conversation and look around the room and think, how many people in this room were ever in the room with Dale Earnhardt Sr.? Didn't have to know him, but just were actually in a room with Dale Earnhardt Sr. And used to be everyone, and now there's only a handful of us. And it's like that with Dick. It really is. I wish he was around to tell the stories because we were just getting him to where he was starting to tell us good stories, right before we lost him.
Yeah.
But hey, the Dick Trickle maneuver, no, my daughter's a freshman in college, and I told her, I said, you do whatever you want to do, but the golden rule is you never be the drunkest person in the room, ever.
Yeah.
That person's fun to a point, and then they just bring it down for everyone else. And so Dick Trickle was never the drunkest person in the room, but you would lose that bet everywhere you went because everybody would think other people would lose that. Everybody thought he was probably just chilling drunk over in the corner, and the reality was he was on beer 2, and the rest of us were on beer 9.
Yeah, that's the trick. I think I just, because I think it's such a fun thing, I really just want the Dick Trickle maneuver to be like the official name of this thing. That's it. I like if that could be my one lasting thing to push forward. And then if you tell it to the uninitiated, I'm sure the next question will be like, I'm sorry, who Trickle? What Trickle? And then
wait, can we talk about
the
name first? Yeah, exactly. But it's the maneuver, man. Again, I used it years ago before I knew that it had a title. I may or may not have used the Dick Trickle maneuver. I think I did at my neighborhood Christmas party, just like a month ago. It's just, the slow burn way is the way to go. But and you're talking about the high holy days of beer at the racetrack.
Yeah.
When I arrived in the mid 90s, you had a Keystone Light car and a Natural Light car. There had just been a Stroh's car. You had Rusty Wallace driving the Miller Genuine Draft. You had Kenny Schrader driving the Budweiser machine, and then the great secret, and then of course the Busch Series. But the great secret of the whole thing was the hookup, because Coors Light, they had the Coors Silver Bullet with Kyle Petty and the Sterling Marlin. But the deal was the hookup. I learned from Kenny Schrader. Kenny Schrader drove the Budweiser car in the 90s for Rick Hendrick. He hasn't driven that car in 30 years. He still gets like a truck of Budweiser to the house every year. I mean, it's just, once you get on the deal, you're on the deal. And Dick Trickle was on the deal, but at the rate that he was drinking beers, a truck of Budweiser would last Dick Trickle a decade. I think it'd probably last Kenny Schrader about 9 days.
Yeah. What's funny is I think about this, and like Dick Trickle, when you think about and you just see a picture of him, I don't think even if you know much about him, you could just see a picture of him and you just like, that guy is an old school guy.
That's it. Yeah. Well, and he sounded like I said, his speaking voice was, it honestly sounded like he'd been, gargling with gravel. Like it just sounded like it just sounded like a guy that drank 15 cups of coffee and smoked a pack of Marlboros or Winstons all day. What was amazing about Dick was Dick Trickle would have this, he supposedly won 1,000 short track races, and you would always want to ask him about it because drivers love to keep lists. They all have lists. They have a list of their wins. They have a list. They'll tell you more about the races they lost. Richard Petty to this day, he'll tell you, he's like, "Where did your dad live?" I'm like, "Monroe." Oh, the Skyview drive-in movie theater had a racetrack, and he goes, "Man, there was a race there in 1963. We should have won." And he'll look at Dale Inman and Dale, "Oh yeah, that's when that guy sold us his bad ball bearings." I'm like, "How do you remember this?" But they remember more about the losses. But that's how I know. I know that Dick Trickle knew how many races he'd won. And so when we would press him, and I did it multiple times on he won 1,000 short track races. I'm like, "Dude, I know you got a notebook somewhere. I know you got a list." And he just laughed, and I feel like maybe he was pulling the Dick Trickle maneuver on me with that. Like he knew exactly how many he had. He knew exactly what the deal was, but he didn't want to show his hand. Just like, he didn't show his hand on a Saturday night.
Yeah. I guess if you tell the whole story or you give the game away, then I guess you lose the mystique a little bit.
Yeah. Well, you know what role you're playing. And all we want, Jeremy, really is, all we want is the genuine article. Just be yourself. Just be you. I may not like you. I might really like you, but just be whoever it is you actually are. And Dick Trickle was exactly who you wanted him to be. He just might not have been as drunk as you thought that he was.
That's ESPN senior writer Ryan McGee. You can listen or watch his show, Marty and McGee, on Saturday mornings on the SEC Network and on ESPN Radio. This episode is a production of the North Carolina Rabbit Hole, a weekly newsletter about North Carolina. You can sign up today at ncrabbithole.com. I'm Jeremy Markovich. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.